Falsely accused and thrown into a brutal prison ruled by a tyrant, Mateo fights to survive in a world of fear and betrayal. But when he finally rises to lead a rebellion, a shocking truth threatens to destroy everything he's built. What will he do when trust becomes his greatest enemy? The roaring gates of La Cruz Penitentiary slid shut behind Mateo, their metallic clang reverberating in his chest like a death knell. The overwhelming stench of sweat, grime, and despair assaulted his senses as he was marched down a dimly lit corridor. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the prison itself sought to crush him. Mateo's hands clenched into fists. He hadn't committed the crime. He'd said it 100 times during the trial. Yet the system didn't care about innocence. It cared about conviction. His protests had fallen on deaf ears, and now he was just another inmate in one of the most notorious prisons in the country. "Move it," barked a guard, shoving him forward. Mateo stumbled but kept his footing, his head held high despite the weight of the chains around his wrists and ankles. His defiance didn't go unnoticed. A man with a chiseled jaw and ice in his eyes observed from the shadows. The glint of silver on his uniform identified him as Captain Ramirez. Ramirez stepped forward, his boots echoing ominously against the concrete floor. "Welcome to hell," he sneered, his voice as cold as his gaze. "You'll learn fast, or you won't last. Either way, I own you now." Mateo met his stare but said nothing. The smirk that spread across Ramirez's face told Mateo all he needed to know. This wasn't just a prison. It was a kingdom of cruelty, and Ramirez was its unrelenting ruler. The orientation was swift and brutal. Stripped of his belongings, Mateo was shoved into a cell barely big enough for its rusted cot. The door slammed shut, the sound resonating like a judge's gavel. He leaned against the wall, taking in his surroundings. The muffled cries, curses, and occasional laughs of the other prisoners told him this was no place for weakness. The next day, Mateo was introduced to the rules, not the official ones, but the unspoken code that governed life inside La Cruz. Luis, an older inmate with a limp and kind eyes, approached him in the yard during their brief break. "Keep your head down," Luis advised, his voice low and urgent. "Don't draw attention unless you're ready to fight for it, and never cross Ramirez." Luis explained the delicate balance within the prison, where alliances were fragile and betrayal was currency. Mateo listened intently, his sharp mind already piecing together the hierarchy. Luis was his first ally, offering guidance with the air of someone who had seen too much. But La Cruz didn't give anyone time to adjust. Mateo witnessed the brutality firsthand that evening. A scrawny inmate named Enrique had failed to complete his assigned work, earning the ire of a guard. In front of the entire yard, Enrique was humiliated, stripped, and beaten while the guards laughed. The prisoners watched in silence, their faces a mask of indifference. Mateo's stomach churned at the display, but Luis gripped his arm. "Don't look too long," Luis murmured. "They'll see it as weakness or defiance. Neither is good." Mateo tore his gaze away, his fists trembling at his sides. He felt powerless, an insect under the boot of a sadistic god. That night, as he lay on his cot, Enrique's cries echoed through the walls. Mateo knew he couldn't stay silent forever, but for now, survival meant adapting. In the shadows of La Cruz, the seeds of rebellion were sown. Mateo didn't know when or how, but a fire was igniting within him, tempered by his indignation and the quiet resolve to reclaim his dignity. Mateo spent his first days at La Cruz absorbing every detail like a sponge. The hierarchy, the routines, even the way the guards patrolled, it all mattered. Luis's advice echoed in his mind. Keep your head down. But in a place where survival depended on invisibility, Mateo's quiet demeanor inadvertently painted a target on his back. Captain Ramirez noticed him almost immediately. "New guy," Ramirez drawled one afternoon, his voice cutting through the din of the yard. Mateo tensed, but didn't turn to face him. "You've got that look," the captain continued, his boots crunching over the gravel as he approached. "Like you think you're better than the rest of them." "I don't think anything," Mateo replied, his tone measured, his gaze fixed on the ground. Ramirez chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "We'll see how long that lasts." The captain walked away, but Mateo could feel the eyes of the guards lingering on him. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. The warning was clear. No one escaped Ramirez's attention for long. Luis sat beside Mateo on the splintered bench in the yard later that day. "You're not the first to catch his eye," he said, his voice low. Ramirez likes to break people. He'll test you, push you, until you snap. Mateo nodded, his expression unreadable. What did you do when he came after you? Luis smiled faintly. I survived. That's all you can do. Survival wasn't easy at La Cruz, a fact that became brutally clear during a collective punishment session in the mess hall. One of the inmates had stolen food, a loaf of stale bread, and the guards decided everyone would pay for it. The meal trays were overturned, their contents spilled onto the grimy floor, and the prisoners were forced to clean up the mess on their knees while the guards jeered. As Mateo scrubbed the cold, greasy tiles, he heard a soft voice above the chaos. Keep your head down. Don't let them see your anger. Looking up, he saw a woman in a lab coat, Clara, the prison doctor. Her dark eyes held a flicker of kindness, an anomaly in a place devoid of humanity. She crouched beside him, pretending to inspect his arm. You're bleeding, she murmured, slipping a bandage into his hand under the guise of examining him. Be careful. Mateo barely had time to thank her before she stood and moved on. The brief exchange stayed with him, though. Clara was risking her position to help, and that meant there was still some humanity left in La Cruz. It was a fragile thread, but it gave him something to hold on to. Over the next few weeks, Mateo settled into the rhythm of prison life. He followed Luis's advice, staying out of conflicts and observing quietly. He learned to avoid the power-hungry inmates who acted as informants, and he noticed patterns in the guards' routines. Every detail mattered, especially in a place where a single misstep could mean the difference between life and death. But even as Mateo kept his head low, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ramirez was waiting for him to slip. And in the quiet moments, when the noise of the prison died down, Mateo's thoughts returned to Clara's fleeting kindness and Luis's cautious wisdom. Survival wasn't enough. Not here, not under Ramirez. There had to be more. For now, though, he played the game. The fire smoldered within him, but he would let it burn in silence. The tension in La Cruz reached a boiling point one sweltering afternoon. Mateo and Luis sat in the yard, the sun bearing down on them mercilessly. Luis was recounting an old story, something about his daughter's laugh, when a scuffle broke out near the weight bench. Two prisoners, young and wiry, shouted insults, their faces red with rage. Guard bait, Luis muttered, shaking his head. They'll pounce on this. Sure enough, the guards descended like vultures. Ramirez was at the forefront, his cold gaze assessing the scene. He barked an order, and the young men were dragged apart, their protest drowned by the captain's booming voice. Teach them a lesson, Ramirez instructed, his words sharp as a blade. The guards moved in, clubs raised, and the prisoners braced for the beating. Mateo clenched his fists, every instinct screaming at him to intervene. Luis placed a hand on his arm, his expression grave. Don't, he whispered. You can't help them, not now. But as the first blow landed, a third figure stepped between the guards and the cowering prisoners. It was Luis. Enough, Luis shouted, his voice firm and commanding. The yard fell silent, every pair of eyes locked on the older man. Ramirez's lip curled in disdain. You're out of line, old man. Luis didn't flinch. They're kids, he said. This isn't discipline, it's sadism. The air grew thick with tension as Ramirez strode toward him, his every step deliberate. He stopped inches from Luis, towering over him. For a moment, Mateo thought the captain might back down, but then Ramirez drew his sidearm. No one challenges me, Ramirez growled, his voice low and dangerous. Without another word, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the yard, followed by a stunned silence. Luis crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The guards dragged the two young prisoners away, their cries muffled by the oppressive weight of the moment. Mateo froze, his body paralyzed by shock. He stared at Luis's lifeless form, his mentor's words ringing in his ears. Survive. That's all you can do. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. That night, back in his cell, Mateo sat on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. Grief clawed at his chest, raw and relentless. Luis had been the only light in this hellhole, and now that light was gone. Ramirez had taken it, just as he'd taken the dignity of countless others. The other prisoners were silent during the nightly head count. Mateo saw it in their faces, the fear, the resignation. Luis's death was a reminder of Ramirez's absolute power, a warning to anyone who dared to step out of line. But for Mateo, it was a turning point. As he lay on his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, a single thought consumed him. Luis's sacrifice couldn't be in vain. Mateo had to do more than survive. He had to fight. The fire that had smoldered within him now roared to life, fueled by rage and a newfound resolve. The first loss was irreparable, but it wouldn't be the last. Mateo vowed that if Ramirez wanted a war, he'd give him one. Luis's absence left a void in the prison that was palpable. His death hung over the inmates like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. For Mateo, the loss was a catalyst. It wasn't just grief, it was fuel. If he wanted justice for Luis and the others who had suffered under Ramirez, he needed allies, a plan, and patience. The first step was observation. Mateo spent his days in the yard, the mess hall, and during the forced labor shifts, paying close attention to the routines of the guards. He noted the rotations, the blind spots, and the moments when discipline wavered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Word of Mateo's quiet defiance spread among the prisoners. Some began to approach him, discreetly at first, offering murmured words of support or simply standing close, a silent show of solidarity. Among them was Javier, a wiry man in his late 20s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. "Ramirez thinks he's untouchable," Javier said one afternoon, his voice barely audible over the clinking of chains. "You've got people watching you now. Use it." Mateo studied him carefully. Javier was ambitious. That much was clear. But ambition could be a double-edged sword. Still, Mateo needed every resource he could get. "What about you?" Mateo asked. "Are you ready to stand up when it counts?" Javier grinned. "I've been ready since the day I got here." The next recruit came by chance. Hector, a towering man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, was a former gang leader with a reputation for violence. Mateo observed him during a shift in the laundry room, where Hector intimidated the guards with nothing more than his presence. He was the kind of man who could inspire fear or loyalty. "Hector," Mateo said during a water break, his tone casual but deliberate, "you don't strike me as someone who likes taking orders." Hector raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "What's your point?" Mateo leaned in, lowering his voice. "I think you're tired of this place, same as the rest of us. Maybe it's time we stop surviving and start taking back control." For a long moment, Hector said nothing. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "I'll listen, but if you waste my time, you'll regret it." The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of Clara. Mateo sought her out during a routine medical checkup, carefully choosing his words. "You're different," he said, wincing as she cleaned a cut on his hand. "You actually care." Clara glanced at the door before replying. "Caring doesn't count for much in here." "It does to us," Mateo countered. "We need help, information, supplies. I know it's a risk, but if we don't do something, people like Ramirez will keep killing." Her hands paused and she looked him in the eye. "Do you even have a plan?" "Not yet," Mateo admitted, "but I will, and when I do, I'll need someone like you." Clara sighed, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the decision. Finally, she nodded. "I'll do what I can, but if we're caught, you're on your own." Mateo smiled faintly. "That's all I can ask." With allies in place, Mateo began planting the seeds of rebellion. It started small, quiet conversations in the shadows, coded signals during work shifts, and whispered promises of change. The guards remained oblivious, their confidence in Ramirez's iron grip blinding them to the growing unrest. For the first time since his arrival at La Cruz, Mateo felt hope. The path ahead was treacherous, but he wasn't walking it alone. Together they would take back their dignity and their freedom. The tension in La Cruz was like a taut wire, ready to snap. Mateo and his growing circle of allies began to test the waters, their acts of resistance carefully calculated to avoid immediate suspicion. The first steps were subtle, a deliberate sabotage here, a redistribution of stolen goods there. They couldn't afford mistakes, not yet. It began in the kitchen. The prisoners responsible for preparing meals were under constant scrutiny, but one of Javier's contacts worked on the night shift, where oversight was looser. Using Mateo's instructions, the inmate tampered with the supply chain, diverting small amounts of food to the weakest prisoners. For days, Ramirez and the guards failed to notice, but when they finally did, the punishment was swift. "Who's responsible?" Ramirez barked in the mess hall, his voice echoing off the walls. His icy gaze swept over the inmates, daring someone to step forward. No one did. The silence infuriated him. He signaled to a guard who overturned a tray of food onto the floor. "If no one talks, you all pay." The collective punishment only fueled the prisoners' determination. Hector smuggled news of the incident to the other inmates, spreading the story like wildfire. The guards had tried to break them, but instead, they had strengthened their resolve. Encouraged by the success, Mateo and his group escalated their efforts. During a maintenance shift, Hector and two others cut the power supply to the kitchen, plunging it into darkness during peak hours. The guards scrambled to restore order, their frustration evident. "That was risky," Clara whispered to Mateo later that evening as she treated a bruise on his arm. "If they find out who's behind this..." "They won't," Mateo assured her. "We're careful." But the increased resistance didn't go unnoticed. Ramirez tightened security, his paranoia growing. Random cell inspections became more frequent, and guards were instructed to keep a closer watch on the inmates during shifts. Despite the heightened surveillance, the prisoners' morale soared. For the first time in years, they felt a glimmer of control. Mateo's leadership solidified, and whispers of his name began to circulate through the prison. "Mateo," Javier said one evening as they sat in the dimly lit yard, "you're becoming a symbol. People are looking to you for more than just small wins." Mateo nodded, his expression serious. "That's why we can't stop. Every step we take chips away at their power. But we can't get reckless. Not yet." The next act of defiance came during a labor shift. Hector orchestrated a deliberate slowdown in production, forcing the guards to intervene. The incident caused delays that rippled through the prison's schedule, further eroding the guards' control. As the guards' frustration grew, so did the prisoners' unity. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, was a reminder that they weren't powerless. And while Ramirez and his enforcers remained a looming threat, Mateo and his allies knew they were laying the groundwork for something much bigger. The battle for La Cruz had begun, and the first strikes had landed. The prison's undercurrent of rebellion grew stronger with each act of defiance, but with growth came risk. Mateo had worked tirelessly to maintain secrecy, but La Cruz was a place where survival often meant betrayal. Trust was scarce, and suspicion was a constant companion. One evening, Mateo sat with Javier and Hector in the dimly lit common area. They spoke in hushed tones, reviewing the next steps in their plan. "We hit the supply room next," Mateo said, his voice low. "Small, strategic, just enough to disrupt their logistics without raising alarm." Javier nodded. "I've got someone who can get us access." But Hector frowned. "There's too much heat right now. Ramirez has his men watching every move. We've got to be sure we're not being watched ourselves." The warning hung heavy in the air. Mateo didn't respond, but the thought lingered long after the meeting ended. Hector's concern wasn't unwarranted. The guards had seemed unusually well-informed lately, almost as if they were anticipating the prisoners' moves. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a shift in the workshop, Mateo overheard two guards talking. "Diego's been a good source," one said. "Keeps us a step ahead of their little games." Mateo's blood ran cold. Diego. A quiet, seemingly unassuming inmate who had blended into the background during the rebellion's early stages. He'd been privy to their plans, even helped during some of the smaller operations. And now it seemed he was feeding information to the enemy. Mateo approached Hector that evening. "We have a problem," he said, relaying what he'd overheard. Hector's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "What do we do?" Hector asked. "We can't confront him directly," Mateo said. "If we tip him off, he'll warn the guards and it's over. We need to turn this to our advantage." Mateo's plan was simple but risky. They would feed Diego false information, leaking details about a staged act of sabotage. If the guards took the bait, they'd know for sure that Diego was the mole. It was a calculated gamble, one that required precision and trust in his closest allies. The trap was set. Mateo accidentally let Diego overhear a conversation about a planned blackout in the West Wing. Within hours, the guards had doubled their presence there, their movements confirming Mateo's suspicions. Diego had sold them out. Now that the mole was exposed, Mateo faced a dilemma. Eliminating Diego could send a clear message to would-be traitors, but it might also attract unwanted attention from the guards. Instead, Mateo chose a subtler path. He approached Diego the next day, his tone calm but firm. "We know what you've been doing," he said, his words cutting through Diego's feigned innocence. "You've been playing both sides." Diego stammered, but Mateo held up a hand. "We're not going to expose you, not yet. Instead, you're going to pass along information we give you. And if you try anything, you'll wish the guards got to you first." Fear flashed across Diego's face, and he nodded reluctantly. The dynamic had shifted. Mateo had turned the mole into a pawn, a tool to manipulate the guards and gain an edge. That night, Mateo stood in his cell, staring out at the darkened yard. La Cruz was a battlefield, and every move mattered. The discovery of Diego's betrayal was a reminder that even among allies, vigilance was essential. But Mateo felt a small sense of triumph. For now, they were one step ahead. The tension in La Cruz had reached a breaking point. With each small victory, Mateo and his allies grew bolder, but so did the risk. The discovery of Diego's betrayal had reinforced one truth: there was no room for error. If their rebellion was to succeed, they needed a plan, a real one. Mateo gathered his closest allies in a secluded corner of the yard during the evening break. The group included Javier, Hector, and a few others who had proven their loyalty. Clara, though absent, had provided crucial intel about guard rotations and supply routes. Mateo had spent days piecing it all together, and now it was time to act. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Mateo began, his voice steady but low. "Their control depends on three things: power, communication, and fear. If we can disrupt two of those, the third will crumble." Hector folded his massive arms. "What are you proposing?" Mateo leaned in, his tone deliberate. "The generator powers the lights, the cameras, and the electronic locks. If we take it out, we plunge this place into darkness. The guards will be disoriented, vulnerable." Javier frowned. "And what about communication? They'll call for reinforcements." Mateo nodded. "Exactly. That's why we hit the comms room next. Clara's already confirmed the locations of the backup radios. We destroy them all, and they're cut off." The group exchanged glances, the weight of the plan sinking in. It was bold, risky, but it was also their best shot. "Timing is everything," Mateo continued. "The generator is most vulnerable during the night shift, when the guards are tired and complacent. That's when we move. Hector, you'll lead the team to the generator. Javier, you'll handle the comms room with me." Hector raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And what if something goes wrong?" "It won't," Mateo replied, his voice firm. "We've accounted for every detail." But not everyone was convinced. Javier leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mateo, this plan relies on perfect execution. One mistake and we're finished. Are you sure we're ready for this?" Mateo met his gaze. "I'm sure. But if anyone has doubts, speak now. There's no shame in stepping back." A heavy silence fell over the group. Finally, Hector grunted. "I'm in." Javier sighed but nodded. "Let's do it." With the plan set, the group turned their attention to the details. Clara had arranged for supplies, wrenches for the generator, improvised explosives for the radios, and medical kits for inevitable injuries. The prisoners practiced hand signals and contingency plans, rehearsing every step until it was second nature. But as the night of the operation approached, Mateo felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure meant not just punishment, but annihilation. Still, there was no turning back. On the eve of the mission, Clara met Mateo in the infirmary. She handed him a small folded map with the final details marked in her neat handwriting. "This is the last time I can help like this," she said softly. "If they find out—" "They won't," Mateo assured her, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Thank you, Clara. We couldn't do this without you." Clara hesitated before nodding. "Just be careful." As Mateo returned to his cell that night, the weight of their gamble settled on his shoulders. The plan was in place, the pieces aligned. All that remained was execution. In the darkness of his cell, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, they would take the first step toward freedom, or their final step toward ruin.
The air in La Cruz was heavy, charged with the kind of tension that preceded a storm. Rain lashed against the prison walls, a rhythmic drumming that masked the quiet movements of Mateo and his allies. The storm was both a blessing and a curse. It provided cover, but it also added an unpredictable element to their carefully laid plans. Mateo tightened the straps of his makeshift tool belt, his eyes scanning the shadows of the yard. The prisoners moved like ghosts, slipping through the darkness toward their targets. Hector's team would head to the generator, while Mateo and Javier tackled the comms room. The timing had to be perfect. "You ready for this?" Javier asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. Mateo nodded. "Stick to the plan."
No improvising unless absolutely necessary. Javier grinned, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his nerves. Got it. The group split at the yard's edge, each team disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of the prison. Mateo and Javier moved quickly but cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the storm. The comms room was on the second floor, heavily guarded but vulnerable in its isolation. When they reached the door, Mateo signaled for Javier to hold. 2 guards stood outside, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Mateo crouched behind a stack of crates, his mind racing. They had planned for this. Clara had provided a vial of chloroform and rags, but using it would take precision. Javier gave a small nod and they moved in tandem. The guards barely had time to react before Mateo and Javier were on them, pressing the soaked rags over their mouths. The struggle was brief, and soon, both guards were slumped against the wall, unconscious. Inside the comms room, the hum of machinery filled the air. Mateo wasted no time, directing Javier to disable the radios while he planted the explosives. The devices were crude, cobbled together from stolen supplies, but they would do the job. As Mateo worked, a crackling sound came from the radio console. Base to all units, increased patrols near the generator. Repeat, increased patrols. Mateo's heart sank. The guards were onto Hector's team. Javier, finish up here, Mateo ordered. I'm going to the generator. Javier hesitated but nodded. Be careful. Mateo sprinted through the hallways, his pulse pounding in his ears. The storm outside intensified, thunder shaking the walls. When he reached the generator room, the sight froze him in place. Hector and his team were pinned down, taking cover behind a stack of barrels as guards exchanged fire with them. The air reeked of gunpowder and sweat. Ramirez stood at the center of the chaos, barking orders, his presence a cold reminder of the stakes. Mateo scanned the room, his mind racing. He spotted Clara in the corner, her hands bound, a guard standing over her with a rifle. She must have been captured during her attempt to secure medical supplies for the mission. Clara, Mateo whispered under his breath. He had to act fast. Using the storm to his advantage, Mateo circled the room, sticking to the shadows. He reached the guard holding Clara and struck with precision, taking him down silently. Clara's wide eyes met his as he untied her. Stay low, he whispered. This isn't over. Ramirez turned, his gaze sweeping the room. I know you're here, Mateo, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Come out, and I might spare your friends. Mateo clenched his fists, his anger threatening to overwhelm him. He had planned for sabotage, not open conflict. But Ramirez had forced his hand. Taking a deep breath, Mateo stepped out of the shadows. Let them go, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging both inside and outside. Ramirez smiled, his gun aimed directly at Mateo. So predictable. The storm outside roared, lightning illuminating the room. Mateo met Ramirez's gaze, his resolve unwavering. The final confrontation had begun. The generator room was a battlefield, chaos erupting in every corner. Rain seeped through cracks in the ceiling, puddles forming on the concrete floor as guards and prisoners exchanged blows. Amid the chaos, Mateo locked eyes with Ramirez, their unspoken animosity palpable. You've caused quite the mess, Ramirez sneered, his gun steady in his hands. Did you really think this little rebellion would get you anywhere? Mateo stepped forward slowly, hands raised, the storm outside punctuating his every move with thunder. It's already gotten us somewhere. Look around, Ramirez. You're losing control. Ramirez's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. I've crushed better men than you. Before he could pull the trigger, Mateo lunged to the side, knocking over a stack of metal tools that clattered to the floor. The distraction gave Hector and the others a chance to press forward, forcing the guards to retreat further into the room. Mateo seized the moment, grabbing a broken pipe from the ground and advancing on Ramirez. Their fight was brutal, a clash of brute strength and sheer will. Ramirez was larger, stronger, but Mateo's speed and determination gave him an edge. The two exchanged blows, their grunts drowned out by the storm and the shouts of prisoners and guards alike. Is this all you've got? Ramirez taunted, swinging his fist. Mateo ducked, the punch grazing his shoulder, and retaliated with a sharp jab to the ribs. The captain staggered but didn't fall. This is for Luis, Mateo spat, driving his knee into Ramirez's stomach. The memory of his mentor's death fueled his every move, his fury giving him strength. Ramirez stumbled, clutching his side, but managed to regain his footing. You think you can win? Ramirez growled, wiping blood from his lip. This is my kingdom. You're just a cockroach. Mateo didn't reply. Instead, he feigned left, then swung the pipe with all his might, catching Ramirez across the jaw. The captain went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Mateo pounced, pinning him to the ground. Your kingdom is crumbling, Mateo hissed, tightening his grip on Ramirez's collar. You've ruled with fear, but that ends now. Ramirez glared up at him, defiant to the last. You think this makes you a hero? You're just like me. Mateo hesitated, his grip faltering. For a brief moment, he saw the truth in Ramirez's words. But then he remembered Clara's compassion, Luis's sacrifice, and the hope he'd seen in the eyes of his fellow prisoners. No, he wasn't like Ramirez. He never would be. He released the captain, letting him fall to the floor in a heap. You don't deserve an easy way out, Mateo said, his voice cold. You'll answer for what you've done. By now, the guards had been subdued, their weapons confiscated by Hector and the others. Clara emerged from the shadows, her hands steady as she tended to the wounded. The prisoners, battered but victorious, stood together in the dim light of the generator room, their unity unbroken. Mateo turned to them, his chest heaving. It's not over yet, he said, his voice carrying above the storm. We have control of the prison, but the real fight is just beginning. They'll come for us. Javier stepped forward, a grin spreading across his bruised face. Let them come. We'll be ready. As the prisoners secured the generator room and regrouped, Mateo looked down at Ramirez, who now lay unconscious on the floor. The captain, once the embodiment of power and fear, was nothing more than a broken man. Mateo knew their fight wasn't over, but for the first time since his arrival at La Cruz, he felt the weight of hope pressing against the despair. The tyrant had fallen, and with him the first wall of the prison's oppressive rule. The dawn, after the storm brought a strange stillness to La Cruz. The air was damp, the remnants of rain dripping from rusted bars and pooling in the yard. The prisoners, still grappling with the reality of their victory, moved with a mixture of exhaustion and purpose. The oppressive regime of Ramirez was no more, but the road ahead was uncertain. Mateo stood in the middle of the yard, his gaze sweeping over the men and women who had fought beside him. They were battered, some bleeding, but alive. For the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were free, at least within the walls of La Cruz. Clara approached, her hands smeared with blood and dirt, but her eyes steady. Most of the wounded will recover, she said, but supplies are running low. If reinforcements arrive, we won't last. They'll come, Mateo replied, his voice firm. But we're not the same prisoners we were yesterday. They'll find a force waiting for them. Clara gave a small, weary smile. You've given them something they haven't had in years, hope. As Clara moved to tend to another prisoner, Hector joined Mateo, his imposing frame a reassuring presence. What's next? Hector asked, his tone measured. Ramirez is out of the picture, but the guards we captured won't stay quiet forever. Mateo turned to Javier, who had just returned from inspecting the captured guards. What's their status? Javier shrugged, shaken but quiet. They know they're outnumbered. For now, they're more useful alive. Mateo nodded. Keep them under control. We'll use them as leverage if we have to. The day passed in a flurry of activity. The prisoners fortified key areas, rationed supplies, and organized patrols. Mateo worked tirelessly, delegating tasks and addressing concerns, but his thoughts were never far from the larger battle looming on the horizon. By nightfall, a semblance of order had returned to La Cruz. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, their faces lit by the dim glow of emergency lights. Clara stood beside Mateo, holding a portable recorder she had smuggled into the prison months ago.
This, she said, holding up the device, contains everything. Recordings of abuse, of Ramirez's orders, of the guards' complicity. If we get this to the right people, the world will know what happened here. A murmur spread through the crowd. For many, the idea of exposing La Cruz's horrors was as terrifying as it was liberating. They had lived in fear for so long that hope felt almost foreign. Mateo raised his hand, silencing the room. This isn't just about us, he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. It's about everyone who's been crushed by this system. If we stand together, we can force them to listen. The prisoners erupted in applause, their unity solidified by the shared goal. Mateo felt a swell of pride and responsibility. He had led them this far, but the journey was far from over. As the prisoners dispersed, preparing for whatever came next, Matteo found a quiet moment to himself in the yard. The stars were faint but visible, a stark contrast to the darkness he had endured since his arrival at La Cruz. Clara joined him, her presence a welcome comfort. "You've changed," she said softly. Matteo glanced at her. "So have you." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but what matters is what you've given them. You've turned prisoners into fighters, victims into survivors." He looked back at the stars. "I didn't do it alone." For the first time in months, Matteo allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, but for now, La Cruz was theirs. The walls that once symbolized oppression now held the promise of a new beginning. The story of Matteo is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest places, courage and unity can ignite change. It challenges us to reflect. When faced with injustice and impossible odds, would we have the strength to rise, to fight, and to inspire others? Matteo's journey isn't just about survival. It's about finding purpose and reclaiming dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. What would you have done in his place? Would you lead, follow, or stay silent? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore the lessons we can draw from stories like Matteo's. Don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking content that inspires and challenges you to see the world and yourself through a new lens. See you in the next video.